The legend of Betty Williams still haunts Odessa, Texas, decades after her tragic death. Teenagers who would gather outside Odessa High School believed that Betty's ghost wandered the auditorium. Teenagers would gather in the parking lot across from Odessa High School, searching for a thrill. They'd turn off their engines, flash their headlights, and call out to the ghost they knew only as Betty. As the legend went, if they honked 3 times or shouted her name, Betty would appear at the windows of the auditorium. They said she had died tragically on stage, and her spirit haunted the school ever since. The real Betty Williams had been a student at Odessa High years before. She had graced the stage in the school plays, a talented girl with big dreams and even bigger heartache. But the details of her death had been twisted with time, like all ghost stories. Some said she fell from a ladder during rehearsal. Others whispered that she had hanged herself in despair. The most chilling version claimed her football player boyfriend had shot her in cold blood, right there on stage. What the teenagers likely didn't know was that Betty's death wasn't an accident or an urban legend. It was a true story of love, betrayal, and a pact with death that left an entire town haunted. Odessa High School may have painted over the auditorium's windows and bricked up its facade to keep the curious away. But the memory of Betty, the Odessa Girl, was never truly buried. Her story still lingers in the hallways, in the whispered conversations, and in the eerie quiet that sometimes falls over the school. The real Elizabeth Jean, Betty Williams, wasn't always a ghost. She was a 17-year-old girl living on the outskirts of town in a modest, weather-worn house, just a stone's throw from Odessa's oil fields. The flames of the gas flares would flicker through the night, and the noise from the drilling rigs was a constant reminder of the rough, blue-collar world that surrounded her. Betty's father, John Williams, was a carpenter, but steady work was hard to come by. Her mother, Mary, took a job at J.C. Penney to help support the family. Though Betty's home life was modest, her dreams soared far beyond the oil-stained streets of Odessa. She wanted to escape, to be someone bigger than just another small-town girl. Despite her challenging circumstances, Betty stood out. Not for her beauty, though she was pretty in a simple, natural way, but for her rebellious streak and sharp mind. She had big blue eyes and sandy blonde hair, but it was her attitude that set her apart. Betty wasn't content to blend in with the crowd, and in Odessa, a town that valued conformity, that made her an outsider. She despised the cashmere girls, the popular girls with perfect lives who wore matching outfits and their boyfriends' letter jackets. Betty wasn't part of their world, and while she pretended it didn't bother her, deep down, it hurt. She saw herself as different, even intellectual, scribbling her thoughts in letters she passed to friends during class. She read Kerouac and Ginsberg, devoured Lenny Bruce's anti-establishment comedy, and wore bold outfits, sometimes black clothes with white lipstick, other times jeans without a bra. She was loud in her opinions, even about things most students wouldn't touch, like how wrong it was that black students had to attend a separate high school. But Odessa wasn't ready for someone like Betty. The irony was that, for all her rebelliousness, she wanted what everyone else did, to belong. Betty ached for connection, for someone to truly understand her, even as she pushed people away with her defiant attitude. But the rejection gnawed at her. In the letters she wrote to friends, she confessed that she often felt lonely. "Most people don't understand me," she said. "They offer no challenge to my mind, and no wit to match mine." She longed for connection, but felt no one truly saw her. Among the many boys Betty flirted with at Tommy's Drive-In on Saturday nights, one stood out, Mack Herring. He wasn't the top football player at Odessa High, but he was well-liked. Tall, with jet black hair and a calm demeanor, Mack was the kind of guy everyone respected. He grew up in a solid, middle-class neighborhood. His father ran a successful electrical contracting business, and his family was respected in town. Mack loved to hunt and spend time outdoors. He was the kind of boy who would make sure an injured animal was put down quickly. He hated to see anything suffer. But that same quiet, strong-willed nature would soon lead him to make one of the most incomprehensible decisions of his life. Despite their different social standings, Mack was popular and well-respected, while Betty was seen as a bit of a misfit. The two started dating in the summer of 1960. Betty was thrilled, feeling that Mack really listened to her, something she didn't get from most boys. For a while, she thought she might even be in love. But Mack wasn't nearly as invested. He was careful to keep their relationship discreet, never introducing Betty to his friends or inviting her to the popular parties he attended. Eventually, he ended things and started dating someone who was far more socially acceptable. Betty was crushed. It wasn't just that she had lost her boyfriend, it was that the rejection cut her deeply. She felt humiliated, lonely, and abandoned by the one person who had made her feel like she mattered. As her senior year went on, Betty's life spiraled further into despair. At school, the new drama teacher dismissed her potential, relegating her to stage manager for the spring play instead of casting her in a leading role. To make matters worse, Mack had been cast as one of the stars of the production. Seeing him in the spotlight while she remained behind the scenes only deepened her pain. Her friends began to notice a change in her. Betty started talking more about death, telling anyone who would listen that she didn't want to live anymore. She even climbed the auditorium rafters, threatening to jump, but in the end she couldn't go through with it. Her peers thought she was just being dramatic, but Betty's words weren't idle threats. Her cries for help went unheard, or worse, brushed off as attention-seeking. She became fixated on the idea of death. She asked several classmates if they would kill her, but none took her seriously. To them, it was just Betty being Betty. But when she asked Mack the same question, something changed. At first, he too laughed it off. But Betty was persistent, and eventually, Mack, whether out of sympathy, guilt, or something darker, agreed to do it. It's hard to say exactly why Mack Herring agreed to Betty's morbid request. Maybe he was worn down by her pleading. Maybe he was moved by her despair, or maybe he was just as lost as she was. But whatever the reason, he eventually gave in. They made a pact. Mack would kill Betty. The plan was simple. Betty would meet him and they would drive to a secluded location. She would hold the shotgun to her head, and Mack would pull the trigger. It seemed almost surreal, a bizarre arrangement between two teenagers who had found themselves entangled in something far darker than they could handle. On the night of March 21st, 1961, the pact became reality. Betty snuck out of her house in nothing but pale pink pajamas and a blue-striped duster. She met Mack in an alley behind her house, and they drove to a remote oil field 26 miles outside Odessa. When they arrived at the stock pond, Betty climbed out of the car, her breath fogging in the cold night air. She walked to the edge of the water, shivering slightly as she reached for the shotgun. "Give me a kiss to remember you by," Mack said. Betty complied, thanking him for what he was about to do. She placed the gun barrel to her temple, and with one last plea, "Now!" And Mack did as she asked him. He pulled the trigger. The blast echoed through the quiet night, and Betty collapsed, dead before she hit the ground. With an eerie calm, Mack tied lead weights around her waist and waded into the pond, dragging her lifeless body behind him. He submerged her in the water, watching as the murky depths swallowed her whole. When Betty's mother reported her missing the next morning, police were quick to start questioning her friends. It didn't take long before someone mentioned her request for Mack to kill her. When confronted, Mack didn't hold out for long. He confessed, leading officers to the stock pond where he had hidden Betty's body. The cold efficiency with which he retrieved her body, dragging it from the water in front of law enforcement, shocked everyone. It was as though he was recounting a hunting trip rather than the murder of a girl he once claimed to love. The news spread quickly through Odessa. Mack Herring, the quiet, well-liked football player, had killed Betty Williams, a girl most people barely noticed. The town was in shock, unable to reconcile the gruesome crime with the image of Mack, a popular boy from a respected family. The crime became the subject of constant gossip, with whispers and rumors spreading like wildfire. But what shocked the town more than the murder itself was how people responded. Mack wasn't ostracized by his peers. In fact, many of them stood by him. He was still invited to parties, still welcomed at Tommy's drive-in, and girls continued to visit him, proud of their connection to him. To many of his classmates, Mack wasn't a murderer. He was a tragic figure who had been manipulated by Betty, a girl they painted as a disturbed and dangerous seductress. For Betty, even in death, the rumors were cruel. She was labeled as promiscuous, mentally unstable, and manipulative. Many believed that she had trapped Mack into killing her, pushing him to the brink with her constant talk of death. The tragedy wasn't just about Betty's death. It became a story about how a small town chose to protect its own, how a boy who was part of their social fabric could do no wrong, and how a girl, already on the margins of society, could be so easily discarded. The trial that followed was anything but ordinary. Mack's lawyer, Warren Burnett, crafted a defense that argued Mack was temporarily insane when he killed Betty. According to Burnett, Mack had been pushed to the brink by Betty's pleas, driven to madness by her suicidal obsession. It wasn't murder, Burnett claimed. It was an act of mercy. The defense was unprecedented. They pushed for a pre-trial sanity hearing, arguing that if Mack was found temporarily insane at the time of the crime, he couldn't be held accountable. The judge agreed, and the trial began with the jury tasked with determining Mack's mental state when he pulled the trigger. Witness after witness testified on Mack's behalf. Classmates who had heard Betty's pleas for help took the stand, painting her as a disturbed girl who had manipulated Mack. A psychiatrist testified that Mack had been under so much emotional strain that he wasn't thinking clearly when he committed the crime. When Mack himself took the stand, he told the jury he couldn't explain why he had gone through with it. He claimed to have been in a haze, unable to fully grasp the gravity of what he had done. His testimony, combined with the defense's portrayal of Betty as a dangerous, unstable girl, swayed the jury. After hours of deliberation, the jury found Mack not guilty by reason of temporary insanity. He was free, his life spared, while Betty's was forever lost. As the words "not guilty" echoed through the courtroom, Mack Herring slumped in his chair, overcome with emotion. His classmates and friends rushed to his side, hugging and congratulating him, while Betty's parents quietly slipped out, too heartbroken and defeated to face the spectacle that had just unfolded. For the town of Odessa, the verdict was both a relief and a shock. To some, it felt like justice had been done. After all, Mack was a popular football player who had simply been pushed to the edge by a troubled girl. But to others, especially those who loved Betty, it felt like a cruel miscarriage of justice. How could someone who had taken a life walk away without any real consequences? Mack's acquittal sent ripples through the town, and for weeks afterward people talked of little else. Some saw Betty as a tragic figure, a girl who had spiraled into despair, while others saw her as manipulative, someone who had drawn Mack into her downward spiral. The narrative shifted, And soon Betty's story was less about her death and more about the boy who had killed her. In death, Betty was slowly being erased, transformed from a victim into the villain of her own tragic story. The verdict shocked those who had hoped for justice for Betty Williams. The case set a dangerous precedent. How could someone walk free after admitting to cold-blooded murder? To many, the trial had been a farce, a display of how small-town loyalty and social standing could bend the justice system in someone's favor. Mack's acquittal only furthered the divide between how Odessa viewed the two teens. Betty, the troubled girl who had been desperate for love and acceptance, was seen as the villain. She had forced Mack's hand, driven him to madness with her suicidal desires. People whispered that Betty had been immoral, that she was manipulative, that she had orchestrated her own death. In contrast, Mack was still the boy next door, a popular football player who had simply been pushed too far. Even after the trial, he remained a figure of sympathy for many. His friends continued to support him, and Mack eventually tried to move on with his life. But the shadow of Betty's death followed him. No matter how much people tried to protect him from the weight of his actions, the truth was undeniable. He had taken another life. For Betty's family, the pain never subsided. They had lost their daughter, and in the eyes of the town, she had been blamed for her own death. The stigma surrounding her was so powerful that even decades later her memory remained tainted. Her cousin, Shelton Williams, who would later write about her in his memoir, Washed in the Blood, recalled how the town never fully mourned Betty. Instead, she became a symbol of something to be forgotten, a reminder of a tragedy people were too uncomfortable to fully acknowledge. In the years following the trial, the legend of the Odessa Girl grew. While the real story of Betty Williams faded into the background, her ghost story continued to haunt Odessa High. The students who gathered at the school's auditorium late at night, hoping to catch a glimpse of her spirit, may not have known the full details of her death, but they sensed that something tragic had happened there. The strange occurrences, the flickering lights, the sounds of footsteps in empty hallways, objects moving on their own, were all attributed to Betty's restless spirit. Even faculty members whispered about the ghost, with some claiming they had seen her pacing the balcony or heard her voice in the quiet hours after school had ended. For many, the ghost of Betty Williams became a metaphor for the unease that had settled over Odessa after her death. But the real tragedy of Betty Williams wasn't just the horrific way she died. It was how she lived. She was a girl who longed for escape, who sought love and acceptance in a town that refused to see her for who she was. Her rebellion, her intellect, and her desire to be different made her a target in a place that valued conformity above all else. Betty Williams's story, much like her short life, is filled with unanswered questions. Was she truly suicidal, or was her request for death a dramatic plea for attention? Did Mack act out of love, or was he just as lost and troubled as she was? Decades later, her name still lingers, whispered in the halls of Odessa High, as her spirit, real or imagined, remains a symbol of the town's darkest chapter.